All right, let's begin. I'm so pleased to invite the first panel up. The topic is Being an Arts Capital, Key Global Trends Shaping the Visual Arts in the Next Decade. May I invite the speakers on stage, please, and the moderator. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Lito Camacho, Dr. Zoe Whitley, Mr. Aaron Seeto, Elaine and our moderator, Shareen Khattar. She's the Director of Global Art Capital Private Limited and a consultant to Both Hands Limited, which provides consultancy services and investments in the arts, culture and property sectors in the UK and in Asia. She also sits on the board of the National Gallery Singapore. Over to you, Shareen.
Thank you. Thank you, Ning. Thank you, Ning, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. In today's forum, the focus is on reimagining the future in the context of what it means to become a global art capital. For this first panel discussion, we will be hearing from our speakers about what the future of art and culture looks like to them, and also they will consider how these trends and forces will shape global art cities of the future. We live in a period of extremely high connectivity, where the opportunities of creating art, viewing art, engaging with art, and purchasing art are almost limitless. Businesses and institutions can engage directly with their consumers and their audiences. There is a proliferation of art fairs across the globe, and the lines between public institutions, private museums, primary and secondary markets, galleries and auction houses are increasingly blurred. At the same time, museums and institutions have to interrogate and re-evaluate their role, function, and audience in this changing art ecosystem. At the heart of this, we also have to consider the rapid advancement of technology. Technology has been harnessed by artists and art businesses alike to disrupt the market, to form new forms of digital art, NFTs, and the creation of new market platforms. And all this, of course, is set against a backdrop of climate change, culture wars, political unrest in many parts of the world. Today we have a lot to unpack, but in order to frame our discussions and make this as fruitful and as interesting, what we have decided to do is to invite our eminent panel here to share their thoughts on some of these key global trends and how these forces may shape the future of visual arts in the next 10 years. We will frame our discussion today by asking each of the speakers a specific question, and then open up the conversation further by inviting responses from other speakers on the panel as well. There will be time at the end of the discussion for an audience Q&A, and we encourage you to use the QR codes on your table to send us the questions and also vote on which questions you would most like to have us address on the panel. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our very eminent panel. To my left, we have Aaron Seeto. Welcome. Aaron is the director of the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Nusantara, Museum of MACAN, a private museum which houses a collection of Indonesian and international modern and contemporary art. And next to Aaron, we have Elaine, editor and publisher of ArtAsiaPacific, a 30-year-old publication dedicated to the contemporary art from Asia, the Pacific, and the Middle East. We then welcome Zoe Whitley, director of Chisenhale Gallery, a leading non-profit space in London founded by artists. Chisenhale produces and commissions new works of art from emerging British and international artists. And finally, we have Lito Camacho, chairman of the University of the Arts Singapore and board member of STPI, Creative Workshop and Gallery. Lito and his wife Kim have been collecting art for over 40 years. At this point, I think we should just jump straight into it and start with our opening question for Aaron. So Aaron, one of the key aspects of this topic that we're looking at today is the changing demographic and behavior of the art audience. Please share with us your thoughts of this changing demographic, first of all, and I would also assume that in a city like Jakarta, where the art-engaged audiences are probably getting younger and younger, and these are individuals who are highly connected and spend most of their lives largely online. This being the case, how do you grow and sustain this new audience and their engagement with art? What are the challenges, and how do you overcome those challenges? Now, we can do this one by one. So,
Oh, it's a big question, Shareen.
Yes.
Thank you for the big question. Well, firstly, let me give you a bit of context, because what we're doing in Jakarta is that we've done so many things for the first time. So in 2017, we opened the first museum of modern and contemporary art. So there were no museums for modern and contemporary art prior to MACAN. And so in 2016, we did a bit of research, and we understood that in Indonesia, which is over 250 million people, there is less than 1% at that time who are actively engaged with art and culture. So that's going to movies, theatre, music. It's a slightly flawed statistic, because it talks about a very particular Western form of culture, but it gives you an indication of where we were starting from. You're right, our audiences are very young, and it actually does more broadly reflect the demographics of Indonesia itself. So internally, of course, we talk about millennials, we talk about Gen Z, but actually we're now starting to talk about alphas. And alphas are really interesting, and because they're starting to articulate their points of view, they're starting to buy things, they're starting to drag their parents into the museum. So we have a very holistic approach about how to engage with people. We know that people have different preferences in terms of communication, and I think, see technology not as something as a disruptor, but actually it's really just the world as it is. So it's incumbent on the museum to change its views about how to engage with people. And I think I started off with this piece about the fact that we are doing so many things we're doing so many things for the first time. It's actually works in our favor, because there's not necessarily prescribed ways of working. So we can play around and be inventive. And I think our practice, the practice that we have inside the museum in Jakarta, suits us. It probably might not translate to other places, but we're very, very aware of our audience. But the reason I think that we have been successful is actually because our mission is relevant. It's not just about numbers for numbers' sake. I mean, we didn't commission that research just because we wanted to hit a KPI, but actually the museum is there to support a bigger vision, and a vision which is really about civic engagement. So it revolves around art education, it revolves around creativity, and the kind of intellectual development of young people in order to have more empathetic, socially engaged, civically minded people. And that's the role of the museum. The role of the museum is not to bring people in. The role of the museum is to facilitate this broader social discussion.
No, thank you, Aaron. I think that's you've raised a very interesting point, which I'm sure some of our other panelists would like to jump in and talk about, particularly the idea of the mission being relevant and the idea of civic engagement. Zoe, coming from an institutional perspective, but quite an interesting one in the form of Chisenhale, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, thank you, everyone, and I'm so pleased to be here. I think two things stick out from the points that Aaron just made, and the first of which is absolutely crucial, and that was the way that you created this caveat around the notion of what culture is and what it could be, and the fact that it behooves all of us to think about culture expansively, and particularly from a point of view that doesn't necessarily look elsewhere or outwardly to what culture is. And that, in terms of what civic engagement is really at the heart of this. And I appreciated so much what you said. During the 5.5 years that I was a curator at Tate Modern, there was a point at which, and one of my colleagues is here in the room, but there was a point at which we had an external PR firm speak to us about the recognition of the brand of this National Museum. And there was some incredulity that local London taxicab drivers weren't familiar with what Tate Modern was. And you might think that curators tend to be a little bit snobby, but interesting. All of us in the room thought, like, why should people know who we are? We need to be making sure that our programming and that our collections are relevant to the city that we're in, even if it is a global city. And that the way that we define culture can't be so narrowly defined as an oil painting or a sculpture in marble, that there are so many ways that we can think about how people choose to spend their free time and what cultural engagement is. And it may well be on a weekend after one has been to church or to a synagogue or to a mosque, spending time in their local park, going to a library. It could also be spending time with your elders, learning a recipe or learning how to sew or to knit. And the fact that these aren't something that's quaint or in some way that we might have defined in a previous century as low culture, that all of those things are culture. And indeed, artists, the artists that I feel fortunate enough to be able to work with some critical proximity, are drawing from all of those things in terms of redefining what culture can be. And I think it's to all of our peril to not acknowledge that. And so to constantly be harking to a solidified notion of what culture is, or one that has been prescribed by only a certain region or a certain part of the world for actually a very limited amount of time, only narrows the audiences that we might be able to reach. So that was really, I think, such an important takeaway for the mission and vision that I feel that you're espousing and recognizing within the Jakarta context.
Thank you, Zoe. And actually, this leads to the question that we are going to pose to Elaine, because this idea of redefining culture through the lens of technology. Technology is changing the way that art is presented to the public. In the commercial art world, the transaction between artists, collectors, and the public was traditionally facilitated by galleries, auction houses, dealers. But today, artists can reach out to a common platform directly. By connecting directly to their audiences or consumers, art and culture has taken on a more populist direction. And this is something that you've mentioned before in our earlier discussions as well. It would be interesting to have you expand on that, but also to talk about what impact this has on the next generation of artists. How will these changes affect the creative economy in the next 10 years or in our near future?
So thank you, Shareen, and thank you, NAC and Ning, for inviting me. So the main hat that I've been wearing for the last 15, 20 years is mainly with my colleagues on stage and many of you here. I call it the priesthood. You know, we are in the art world and we speak the same language, we have the same references. We know how it all works, right? And I started teaching in 2017, art history to art students. And I realized, talking to the art students, which, by the way, makes every day extremely fresh and exciting, they don't, it's too much, I assume too much with these students, that they just follow they're going to follow the same trajectory that we have been going on. When I ask them what they want to do you want, of course you want to show in a gallery. This is not something that they necessarily aspire to. Many of them say they want to create their own platforms to sell their own classmates' work, their other young artists' work. And I, for the majority of them, I feel like there is a parallel reality taking place. And I think that was, of course, it moved much faster during COVID. That's one story I want to talk about. The second one is a friend of mine in Europe. He shows with, let's say, second-tier galleries who show in satellite fairs. And during COVID, he started to, well, of course, he was always posting on Instagram, and he was making more sales directly on Instagram than through his 2 galleries in Europe. And he basically stopped working with them because he was earning enough by making these sales directly on Instagram. The third story I want to bring up is that 2 months ago, 6 weeks ago, I met this artist called Beeple. Now, Beeple, it's funny, Beeple was coming to Hong Kong for M+. And I said to my colleagues at the magazine, shall we interview Beeple? No one really raised their hand. I said to my other colleague, should we interview Beeple? Because in Hong Kong, we've been relatively closed. I was thinking we should meet Beeple because very few people are coming. We should take this opportunity. And my colleague said, well, the 2 editors who might vaguely be interested, they're not vaccinated, so they can go into M+. Then I talked to my stepbrothers who are in public health, and I mentioned Beeple, and my one stepbrother said, he is so cool, I respect him so much. And then he went off and started to talk about Beeple. This is someone who does not speak our language. He's not part of the priesthood. I met Beeple. I decided, my friend who works for the private collector who bought the piece that is now being shown at M+, we had breakfast and he said, Elaine, you should really meet him. He has so much to say. I think it's worth your time. And so a combination of understanding the reality that my students are in, hearing stories such as the one my friend told me about selling on IG, and just the response from my stepbrother about Beeple. And that Beeple overnight became an artist that everyone in this room knows, right? Not just the priesthood. I decided to meet him. And he spoke so openly and honestly about what he does. And in a way that I am convinced that there is definitely 2 parallel realities happening. He became an artist that we all know overnight, but that doesn't mean he was an artist before. He was always making his work. And my friends who are part of the priesthood who said, I can't believe you met Beeple. The only thing I can say is that he had something to say like any other artist. Just because he made a lot of money overnight does not mean he's not as good as someone that we have been following and respect for many, many years, such as Anish Kapoor. And I think that there is room for 2 different kinds of artists. And I also think that we have to acknowledge this. And in a way, this just makes more room for everybody because there are so many art schools producing so many artists. So you also have to ask yourself, where are they going to go? Right? How are they going to get visibility? Which is ultimately what I think all artists want, right? Is for people to look at their work.
Thank you, Elaine. No, that's an interesting point for actually to get Lito's thoughts on. As chairman of University of the Arts, this is now that we're talking about artists, nascent artists in art schools, and these 2 parallel realities, which is very much the world that we live in today. Tell us what you think.
I think it's important to recognize and embrace the idea that art is by nature diverse. It represents diversity. It represents different trajectories. I don't think we can define art and we can define artists. I think they come from different angles, and I think it's important to embrace that. I think implied in your question is almost an assumption that it's going to go one way because of technology and so on and so forth. I don't think so. I think that would be a sad affair if we will define art, in the narrow lens of technology. I think technology enables art, and technology has allowed new art forms like NFT and artists like people, but it does not discount not only the possibility, but the reality that there are many other artists. Some are still practicing, very traditional oil paintings. Some are doing multimedia. Some are doing video, and so on and so forth. And I think it's very important for us, and especially all the art institutions, whether you're a museum, you're a university, and so on, to understand this so that we can all work together to help continue to nurture art in all of these forms. So as a university, for example, we should recognize that technology is making a big difference, and therefore in our programs we should make sure that we recognize that we have instruction that's geared towards all the new technologies that are creating new art. But at the same time, we're still going to look at teaching students in traditional art forms. So it's I don't think it's A or B. I think it's A, B, C, D, all the way to Z.
Yes. No, can't disagree with that. And I think it comes down to the fundamental, which is the artist themselves. And when we think about the questions that we're looking at today, we should be thinking about the why behind culture. And that leads us on to a question for Zoe. Art and culture have important roles to play in building and sustaining communities. But communities themselves are changing. Climate change, mental health, issues of race, gender equality, diversity have come into sharp focus in recent years. So how do you see these themes in terms of how they shape the direction of visual art and culture? And secondly, how would an institution develop a set of priorities to support a creative city that is open to everyone?
Well, thank you, Shareen, for that very simple question.
Take it away, Zoe.
Lucky for all of you, I have solved racism, sexism, and climate change, but I've been keeping it a secret until today. No.
Okay, we can all go and have lunch now. We're done.
Exactly. I think this gets at the heart of something that's really crucial, and some of it is our sector's own capacity for hyperbole and press release, but art and artists can't solve every problem that's of a social making, but certainly valuing the role that artists play in society is paramount. And it's something that needn't be lost when we're having to hold multiple things in our collective consciousness to do with the health of a society, both mentally and physically, to do with making sure that people are fed, that education is a priority. And I think the short answer there, and certainly I'm speaking from someone who does not represent the commercial side of an art sector, but has always been active in the nonprofit making side. And that is really the voice of the artist. And really, to sum it up in one word, it's really purpose. I think that precisely because of headlines that can be grabbed, because of a people, in an esteemed room such as this, there might be a compulsion to say, oh, contemporary art is hot right now, how can we get involved? But I feel like the more important question is the why. How do you keep artists at the center of what you do, that you think about what is possible? Because if you try to be all things to all people, you'll end up being nothing to no one, in my view. So for an organization like the one that I feel very privileged to run, Chisenhale Gallery, which is a nonprofit space that was founded by artists 40 years ago in East London, at the time, not just unfashionable, but socioeconomically very much on the margins of the city. And artists found a building that was disused and asked the council, and this is the Council of Tower Hamlets, if they could have a long lease and, for better or for worse, do the rewiring and the plastering, and to create a space that, as things went along, in 1986, was the location where Richard Deacon showed the sculptures for which the 1987 Turner Prize was awarded, and so on and so forth. And we have an illustrious history that includes really game-changing group exhibitions, some of which are relevant here, like Yellow Peril, New World Asians, but also the first exhibitions by Wolfgang Tillmans and Hito Sterl, Lynette Yarembwachi, just to name a few. Also Lawrence Abu Hamdan. And I think that what's paramount throughout all of that time was an understanding of our role as an artist's art gallery, a place where artists come to see the work of other artists. And so in thinking about a mission and our vision and in defining our values, so much of that has to do with reflecting what we feel we can do with and for artists. So that involves what we refer to as critical friendship, but also a certain type of rigor that's rooted in curiosity and inclusivity. But I think it's also not taking for granted that we are rooted in a local community in East London. And you rightly were looking at the metrics of the city that you're a part of. And in our borough in East London, 0.5% of young people feel that the creative sector is viable for a career path, despite the fact that the creative sector is the #2 contributor to the British economy. So trying to think about ways to, even in small ways, address that disconnect for us has meant doing few things well. And because we know and work with artists, and what I said before, benefiting from that critical proximity, when we were emerging from COVID, and I think that is still, very much an active thing, not past tense, one of the stark realizations was that young people's mental health was really suffering in the capital, and in our part of London in particular. But we had the inside knowledge that there were a number of artists who have also struggled with their mental health and feel open in talking about that as part of their working process. And by working with young people alongside artists, that became a way for us to address one particular thing. You're not going to be able to come to Chisenhale Gallery for pediatric brain surgery. I mean, I'm being ridiculous, of course, but I think that there are times when the creative sector is called upon to come up with creative solutions for problems that are bigger than those of our own making. And that doesn't mean we can't be part of a solution, but I think the part of is crucial, and understanding where we might be able to make any sort of inroads or to do no harm comes from asking questions that are rooted in our mission. So if our mission is to commission new works of art from British artists and international artists, and because we work with them over an 18 to 24 month period of time, some of those questions we might ask during that process is there a way for the materials we use in one commission to potentially help us get to a zero waste exhibition in the next commission? And fortunately for us, the answer in some cases is yes. So between our Abbas Akavan exhibition and our Ryndon Johnson exhibition, we were able to entirely repurpose part of what was meant to be not only site-specific, but a kind of a momentary installation to create what is now the source of projection for a film that then went on to be acquired by Mudam in Luxembourg. So there are times when we can have those wins where we're really thinking about sustainability. We can embed within our local participation practices opportunities to really put mental health, young people locally at the heart of what we do. But within that, there's always that sense of, is this part of our mission? Is this part of our purpose? And there are times when, as difficult as it might be, we can say, actually, that's beyond the scope of what we can do well. And we focus on what we are doing well. And for all of you in this room who are able to make pots, to physically build art spaces, I think it's so crucial to keep artists in your locality within that, because I think the reimagining is so key within this. And certainly what will make Singapore a kind of a destination for the arts won't necessarily be, or I won't even say necessarily, won't be the same set of parameters that made London an arts destination in the past. And indeed, as London looks to what it might be in the future, I think we are having to realize that we need to look elsewhere. We need to make sure that we are responding to a different set of circumstances.
No, that's very inspiring, and definitely sort of a point of which I'd like to sort of throw out to Aaron to sort of comment on as well.
I really like this idea of critical friendship. I think that's, it's got my brain buzzing about what that might look like. But I think, just kind of also responding to what Elaine was talking about, I think what we're really, what is most important is that we need to understand that the priesthood, I also like that. we have our own biases. I mean, and they're more than biases. We have structures that need to be more closely attuned to the impact that our structures have on our communities. And the other thing that you reminded me of is that we need to be more attentive to our artists, and not just to artists, but also maybe the independent spaces, the small spaces, those places that have on the ground have lots of answers for us in terms of how we do our institutional practice. So my understanding of what I think that the future of museums, or the future of our practice, is its porosity, is our ability to be able to identify that things can be done differently elsewhere, and we can experiment and we can take them on, and they might fail, or we might get some wins from it. But I think I really like this attitude, and I think it's probably important for this for policymakers to understand the role that small spaces have in addressing the big problems that are facing us. But one question, and maybe this is something I really want to pick your brains about later, is that also probably for this group, how do you measure the social impact? Because it's not just about numbers of exhibitions. I mean, you've given off a list of artists who've gone on to elsewhere, but these are really important questions around sustainability or race and class and culture. How do you actually measure them?
Sorry to interrupt. No. I'm just sort of watching time as well, but I do think this is a very interesting question that we should come back to and address sort of like when we're looking at the Q&A, because I think I would be very interested to hear about the ideas of measuring impact from everybody's perspective across this panel. But we've talked about the artists, we've talked about small spaces, we've talked about technology. Another part of the art ecosystem that we need to consider today is the perspective from collectors and patrons. So my question to Lito today is a two-part question. I seem to like these two-part questions. How will private patronage shape and influence the key trends in the visual arts? And when we consider the rise of young millennial collectors and, for example, the proliferation of private museums all around the world, what are those implications? What implications are there on how artists make and present their work?
Shareen, my direct answer to your question is it shouldn't. And I think it would be sad if art patrons were to influence the direction of art and artists. Art is creation. Art is not demand-driven. Art should never be demand-driven. We shouldn't have artists who would look at the performance of ArtSG and say, okay, what kind of paintings sold? So that, next month I will start, a new form of art. That would be very, very sad. I think I'm heartened by an article that I recently saw, and I can't remember whether it was in the website of Artsy or Mutual Art. But it was an essay by a writer who talked about a divergence of two communities of artists. And he called them the artists for the art market and the artists for the biennales. And thank God we have artists who are willing to stake their lives, their art, their practice on biennales to create art and not to create art just to sell. And it's very interesting because in that article, it also said that there was very little overlap. When you look at some of the top contemporary artists selling well in art fairs, in galleries, in auctions, They're not the same artists who are participating actively in biennales, triennales, and so on. And I think it's very healthy to see this kind of tension among our artists. But I would be on the side of those who are very focused on biennale, on creating creation. I think, Shareen, you know that we have 6 children, 2 of whom are artists. One is at the back of the room. But we have one who's based in Berlin. And he happens, when I was reading that article, I said, oh my gosh, my son fits so perfectly to the way they were defining this biennale artist. They almost have a disdain for the art market. They create art for the sake of creating art and not to make a living and not to. In fact, our artist son many years ago came to Kim and I and said, Mom and Dad, I think I will be poor and I don't mind it because I want to be an artist. In fact, he's almost embarrassed to be known as our son. But I think it's important to have, to be able to nurture and support art that's creating art. Yeah? And not art that's creating to the market. So, because implied in your question is that whether art patrons like ourselves should be able to influence with our taste, for art, on how art will develop over time. I think art patrons should be influenced by artists and what they're creating. And there will always be artists that, or patrons who will be, attracted, drawn to certain art. We got drawn to Yayoi Kusama back in 2004. And the reason was we thought that her art from 60 years ago, back in the 60s, is as contemporary as it was in 2005 as it is contemporary today. Because, it's really identifying artists. In our collection, it's always been identifying artists that we think have an important message to say, an important language that he or she is introducing. And that's what I believe has defined our art collecting. And I think it's very important. I don't think we should demean art by asking the question whether art patrons will be influencing what artists will be producing in the future.
I think I completely agree with you in terms of the sentiment and the thinking. But my question was sort of based on, to a certain extent, on what Elaine was talking about earlier on as well. These two parallel realities that do coexist out there in the art ecosystem, in the landscape, in the marketplace. Patrons would have always influenced and developed artists' practice and also our understanding of art and culture through private museums and private initiatives. And actually, maybe Elaine, if you can sort of jump in on that as well. From the position of where you sit, looking at sort of Asia-Pacific and South Asia with the publications, this changing face of patronage, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I think the world is shifting because time moves forward. So the collectors of tomorrow will become the collectors of today. So millennials, Gen Zs, alphas, I didn't know that's what they were called, but thank you, Erin. They will be sitting up here and they will, I agree with you, Lito, you shouldn't be influencing our practices, but we also have to face the reality that there is some kind of influence taking place. I think millennials are driving the way. For instance, we look at art, how we consume art. They're much more at ease buying art. Click, I bought it. I like to go to galleries. So I think we're all very old-fashioned up here. I'm not sure that we're imagining a new future, the four of us. But there's even the question about validation from the art market. Do you get validation from a museum show in Jakarta or at M+, or at SAM? Or are you going to get validation by having 1 million followers on Instagram? We're being faced by very different influences that we have actually, not that we don't have any control over, but we're just going in that direction. And I think we can't deny that.
Thank you. On that note, I think we might open the questions up to the audience and to you. And I think we have some questions. Okay, let me start with this question. Against this backdrop of changes and shifts in the visual arts, how do we no, in fact, let me not start with this question because I think this is a very good one for us to end off with. I'm going to change. Okay, let's start with a question that I think a lot of people here in the room are interested in. What would make Singapore a destination for art? Is there anyone on the panel that would like to jump in on that question?
Maybe Shareen, I'll take a crack. I mean, having been in the board of the National Gallery Singapore for 8 years, and then STPI before that, NHB, and now University of the Arts, I think I have a personal stake on that question. Yes. What does Singapore have to do? I think Singapore has to do what it's doing. And it's really building the infrastructure and the ecosystem that's supportive, that's collaborative. I think we heard from Minister Loh, the idea of PPP, the partnership that has to happen between public, private, and people. And I think we're doing all of that, perhaps not as fast as some of us would wish to, and perhaps with the thought that maybe Singapore, and particularly Singapore government, and Minister, I hope you don't mind my saying this, but I think maybe Singapore government has to have a little more patience in building art as a community in Singapore. It does not happen overnight. KPIs won't do it. It's not, I'm sorry to our URA and our SLA friends, it's not a real estate deal. It's not per square foot, what we put up in the National Gallery. It's really more intangible than that. And I think we have to have the patience to believe that art is very important for Singapore because we do want to create or develop a creative society that will be very relevant for the future of Singapore as a city-state. And I hope that our friends in government, especially those here present, would embrace that thought that art and creativity is so crucial to the success of Singapore in the future that if you don't invest in it, I think Singapore may find itself irrelevant in the future. So through the art institutions like the National Gallery, Singapore Symphony, etc., I think they need a lot more support. We have a beautiful building, the National Gallery Singapore. I don't know, I'm not going to say how much we spent on it or how much Singapore spent. I know it's a big, big sum. So we have the hardware, but we don't quite have the software. And I think we need more support, more funding to make sure that we are developing equally both the hardware and the software of all those institutions that we are creating.
Thank you, Lito. We'll jump on to the second question. Because we do have a few questions here. So the second question, as we move to understanding art and culture beyond the Western, what roles do the panel see First Nations and Indigenous artists playing in changing how we view culture and the history of art? Aaron, do you want to take this?
That's the topic for another panel discussion.
So you have 1.5 minutes.
Okay, I think that there are some cues that have already been discussed up here in terms of being more attentive to the ground, right? And in order to do that, you need to be able to understand that people have different perspectives, and not just different perspectives. The art worlds are based on different histories, and it's incumbent on us as people who have the power to make change, to provide those pathways for people who we don't see in this room. It's not easy to do, I don't think. And I think that's probably come from maybe someone from Australia or someone who has really vibrant narratives around First Nations. It is almost non-existent in Southeast Asia, as I said. These are not conversations that we have, and we have to start having them.
No, it's timely and relevant. Would anyone else like to add to that in terms of a perspective?
Well, within the universities and from where I stand in Hong Kong, one of the things that was most striking when they first asked me to teach was they're teaching modern art history from the Western canon. And when I asked them about Asian, they said, oh, we teach ancient Chinese art. So I think it's really important from within Asia, at art schools and universities, to also teach the local histories. And I think that's where these ideas and beliefs and philosophies will actually take shape.
Thank you. We have a question for Zoe from the audience. Should pushing arts boundaries, e.g. wanting an art museum for artists such as Chisenhale, be the work of artists, or should it be the work of policymakers and government?
I guess to come back to a point Lito made, I don't think that the binary of either or is going to be hugely helpful. I mean, over the 40 years, Chisenhale Gallery is not exactly what it was in 1983 any longer. I think that there's something important to be said that, no, I don't think that the mandate for an arts institution necessarily should come from government, certainly if it's not a national organization or a government-run organization. But I think that certainly to the point I was making earlier about the work that we've done just in the last 2 years around youth mental health, that wouldn't have been possible without our working with the Greater London Authority and with major support, which is ongoing, from Mayor Sadiq Khan and the Mayor's office. So as small of an organization as we are, what we were tasked to do was to pilot a program that is now looking to be implemented in various ways throughout Greater London. So I think that there's a way that we can have our autonomy to have come up with something that we feel that we can deliver well. And I don't know, maybe we can get to your point about the metrics, because I think an important part of that, these kind of, again, thinking about the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative, is actually trying to dwell in that sweet spot. It's not just patting ourselves on the back, well, we've done it, that's good enough, but also having some sort of external measures. And again, we're working in very small amounts and with small groups of people, but what we find most useful is the assessment that comes from external bodies. So in working with an organization called CAMS, so the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services within our borough, one of our social work contacts, the lead, who works with 9 to 14-year-olds, has been able to feed back to us some of the differences he's seen in the groups that have been able to work with us. And likewise, where we were working with older adolescents in an inpatient mental health facility, because we stayed in touch with so many of the youth mental health nurses and also what they call the PTs, the physical therapists, we've been able to see in real time and based on their feedback the difference that it's made. And that's been written up, and that's been a way for us to kind of hold ourselves accountable and to think through things. And also the fact that some of those young people now, I can't mention their names in the room, but they define themselves as artists now. That to me feels like a big win, but that's on a measure of like 3, 4, 5 people rather than something I can say we can roll out in the tens of thousands or something like that. But we do aim to kind of to basically get all the help we can get. So to come back to the question that was asked, I think that if government is willing to work with us, or if there are policymakers that recognize that need and are willing to help support in a way that is supportive rather than obstructive, or again, I guess if we were doing something wrong, to hold us to account in that manner, then I think that's helpful. I think none of us do these things alone. So in no way am I thinking that our institution has all of the answers. And there were other international colleagues in this room with whom I have the pleasure of working, and I think our kind of related infrastructures and doing things differently, we're able to learn from one another.
Thank you, Zoe. I mean, the whole question about metrics, accountability, what Lito brought up earlier on about sort of KPIs that may not quantify or qualify the work that an institution is doing today, and the changing face and nature and DNA of what a museum or an institution is today. And this was one of the questions that was raised by the audience as well. There was a question here that talked about the nature of an art institution. What is the future of art institutions? I know that's a very big question, but is there something about the reevaluation and the interrogation of what it means to be a museum, civic engagement, that any of you would like to sort of address at this point, which leads into that question?
I think I said it before. I think that the future is really about being porous. I mean, of course, there are different types of institutions. I think institutions like the Met will never have that porosity. But I think for current practice, I think it's very much more about being attentive to who your communities are, and trying to, if we're interested in these social changes, well, then that work has to happen at that level. It's the institutions that I like are ones where that authorial mode is a little bit more slippery. It's not so straightforward. It's not a lecture. It's about participation. And I think that, so for me, it's not about institutions. Current practice. Let's not talk about the future. Let's talk about now. Current practice should be about these types of community movement.
Thank you. This is a question that I think we should ask each and every member of this panel to address. And I think this question will wrap up our general discussion today as well. So against this backdrop of changes and shifts in the visual arts and cultural landscape, how do we balance global and local characteristics to establish a distinctive arts capital? So it's the local and the global, and how we make a distinctive arts capital by balancing both those sets of priorities. Lito looks like he's picking up the mic.
I'm ready.
I'm ready for you too, Lito. Where are we going on this?
I think the key word in your question is balance. It's, I think for Singapore, and I think the reference is really to Singapore. The question is in reference to Singapore. How should we position Singapore? How do we position our art institution, National Gallery, SAM, the UA University of the Arts Singapore? I think it's really striking a balance that on the one hand, we need to be able to represent the local perspective, whether it's Singaporean or regional, Southeast Asian. That is certainly the case in our collection at the National Gallery, where the focus is on Southeast Asian art. And I think the National Gallery, as the premier art institution here, should be a platform to be able to represent that local perspective, that local content. And we have to aspire to have, the best of what we can show, locally and regionally. And I think we do that. At the same time, that by itself is not going to make Singapore a global, capital for art. We also need to understand that we have to represent and show and showcase and be a platform for showing global, global art and what's relevant, what's excellent, what's being, what's being shown and what's attracting a lot of attention from a global standpoint. So, doing a show on Pek Nam Jun or, is very crucial to the role of the National Gallery Singapore to be able to get that global perspective. So in a way, we are, pushing what we are producing locally and in the region. At the same time, we want to make sure that we continue to be globally relevant, not only for the global audience, but even for our local audience, making sure that, local Singaporeans, all the, people in the hinterlands are also getting this exposure and inspiration, from what's happening globally. Yeah, it cannot be that, we will only show Singaporean and Southeast Asian art. We need to be able to show and demonstrate that there's a lot of art going on, and we should allow our local people to be inspired and to be influenced by those global, developments.
Thank you, Lito. And, Zoe, with Chisenhale, I've noticed that the programming has been increasingly international. Perhaps it's always been as international as that, but it's a global platform, and you've included many Southeast Asian and Asian artists recently as well. Maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of that global perspective.
I think as a tiny microcosm of that bigger question, I was thinking that's a lot of what we aim to do with our mission, and it feels all the more pressing since Brexit to ensure that what is a national agenda doesn't become something that kind of forecloses our ability to reach out. And so I was explaining to one of the colleagues from the National Arts Council this morning that what we try to hold equally is an opportunity. We think of ourselves very much as a neighborhood art gallery with an international reach. And so in that register, what it means for us to be able to work with British artists to hopefully help them reach international aspects of our network. It's as important to make sure that we're creating a welcome for international artists to be able to feel welcome in Britain, where a national policy may potentially feel like it's contradicting that, even if on the ground we aim for that certainly to not be the case. And to quote you again, I think there was something so interesting about what you're saying about the hardware and the software. And in a place where there's such investment in creating an infrastructure, I think that those of us who are in any relative position of power, there's something truly to be gained from ensuring that the employment opportunities are there, that there's a way to involve local people and to value local knowledge in the creation of roles and responsibilities. And I think we all, for an organization of my size, there may be a temptation to look to the bigger organizations as that's the model we have to follow. And then in some other context, to quote your point about the Met, if you say like, oh, that's what we're aspiring to, but actually the role there is to say, actually there are art histories yet to be written, that there's a way for us to hold in balance what an audience might expect, but to surprise them. And I think that there's certain smaller organizations, Veals in Brussels being one. One of the things that they did that was, I think, particularly great was that they were able to time a Wolfgang Tillmans exhibition with Tao Wen Fan, and we were their partners. But so many people came for one exhibition, but then stayed for the other. And that became a way to then introduce a really brilliant artist working in.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
No.
More time. Yeah.
No. That's exactly. That's very illuminating and interesting in terms of how to balance both those interests and characteristics. What would be the challenges, Elaine, that you see faced in terms of trying to maintain that balance?
Well, I think not just from Hong Kong, but I think across Asia, there is this, what you talk about, always looking at the bigger institution. What happens, I feel, is in Asia that there's this insecurity that we always have to look to what Tate Modern has done, and if I ever hear this phrase again, M+ is the Tate Modern of Asia, I think I might gag. But sorry, Tate Modern, if you're out there. I love what you do, but we need our own thing in Hong Kong, right? M+ should just be M+. And National Gallery, I adore, admire, love National Gallery because it has created this very distinct mission and purpose in showcasing modern art from Southeast Asia and telling that story, which is super essential. And the Met could never do that, and I feel Tate could never do that, but it makes sense that it's here. So I think if we could, in Asia, stop looking at the bigger institutions, however you want to define those bigger ones, and make them for the communities in which they're situated, I think that's very essential. I think in terms of being global, I think there's always this anxiety of wanting to be global, so somehow global is already happening, and I think it's really about addressing the local.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point for Aaron to expound on. Again, with your 1 minute, 1.5 minutes.
I'll do it quickly. I think we also have to look at the terminology global. What is interesting about global art is the fact that it's not the same. And we need to be able to inflect personality and local context into our understanding of what the global is. I mean, no one's going, what is great when we've done shows is of, like even Kasama, for instance, is what's most interesting is how your audiences respond to these exhibitions. They don't have the art historical background, and it's also not in their worldview. Like 60s in New York, it's something completely divorced from their daily experience, but watching actually on social media how that they respond and what they pick up is the most fascinating thing. And so when we talk about global, it also goes the other way around. So the big institutions should also be thinking about, well, how do audiences in Singapore or Jakarta or now Hong Kong, how are they responding to this artist who we love and who has got so much aura and history around? So it goes both ways.
Yeah, no, thank you. Because I think we're going to end our discussion this morning on that note, which is a very exciting one. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. I hope you found it fruitful and stimulating, or as fruitful and stimulating as I have found it myself. Thank you very much. And thank you to our speakers.